Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to check and adjust the valve clearance on your TRX450R. Checking the valve clearance is something that should be done as part of your routine maintenance to help prevent problems, but unfortunately most people let this check go too long and wait until the valves are actually out of adjustment and they're starting to have problems. So if the valves are too loose, you're going to have some extra noise coming from the top end. But on the other hand, if the valves are too tight, the machine is going to be hard to start, it's going to have a rough idle, and if that goes left unchecked, the valves can get burned and cause damage. So that's why you want to stay up on this maintenance. Now this machine right here, it's a 2008 TRX450ER, and the 08 to 2014 TRX450ERs have a different auto decompression system than the TRX450Rs or kickstart models, as well as the electric start models that are 06 and 07. So we'll show you how to adjust that other style of auto decompressor a little later on in the video. Now, the maintenance interval for this machine is every 100 hours we want to do this check. And a great way to stay up on that is with an hour meter. So we're at this point and we need to get it done. So let's go ahead and get started. To do this job, we need some common hand tools, and specific things I want to point out are our magnet, feeler gauges, digital caliper. We also have this cam gear holding tool. And then we have some safety wire to hold our cam chain up. These vacuum caps, I'm going to plug the carburetor off with one and our fuel line off with the other one. And then as far as parts go, we're going to be using a new spark plug since we're in there. We've got the timing plug O-rings, our cam chain tensioner gaskets, and then we have our valve cover gaskets. We'll also be using contact cleaner, assembly lube, safety glasses, rubber gloves, and some rags. And you'll always want to refer to your model-specific service manual for more information and specs. Now before we adjust these valves, we need to make sure our engine is at room temperature and we need to gain access to our valve cover. To do that, we're going to remove our seat, gas tank, these front fenders, and there's a plastic tray under that gas tank. All right, the next thing we're going to do is remove this plastic tray. This, to me, is the hardest or most annoying part of the whole job. So if you can make it through this, then the rest should be fairly simple. So what we're going to do is first we'll loosen this cable tie for these wires. Get that out of the way. And I'm just going to leave it loose. The next, we have a clip right here that holds these wires down. We're going to pop that up. And then we have 3 clips that are fastening this thing down. So we're going to remove those. And this third clip is on the right side of the ATV on that coolant reservoir. The next thing we'll do is remove that throttle cable from that clip. I'll try to get that out of the way so you can see this. And right down here, we have a retainer for our idle adjuster. And I'm taking a flat blade screwdriver, turn it sideways, pop that clip open, and we'll pull this out. So now that's out of the way. And then we have our connector on our engine coolant temp sensor. We need to disconnect that. All right, after that, we're going to disconnect the ground and primary wire from the ignition coil. The next thing we need to do is make sure the plastic is pulled away from these clips, and we actually pulled this away when we removed our gas tank to remove those straps. After that, you can remove the hose, and then this wiring harness, all the retainers, you'll want to move them out of that. At this point, you're just going to work this tray out, and there's 2 clips over here, and that's on both sides. You'll pop those up. The next thing we need to do is clean this area up around the valve cover really well so we don't get any dirt in our engine. So I'm just taking a little contact cleaner and a rag. After that, I'm gonna pull this clamp back and remove this vent tube. We'll remove the spark plug cap. And once that's out of the way, I'm gonna use some compressed air to blow out the spark plug hole. Once that's clean, we'll remove the spark plug. Then after that, we're gonna remove this valve cover, and there's two timing caps, so on the right and left side of the engine, we'll remove both of those. Our next step is to get the engine at top dead center on the compression stroke. So what we'll do is rotate the engine in its normal direction of rotation. And on this, we're rotating the engine from the right side and we're going clockwise. We'll watch the cam actually press down on those intake valves. As soon as those valves close, we'll keep rotating the engine over until our mark on the flywheel lines up, and then we're at top dead center on the compression stroke. Now, while you're lining these marks up on the flywheel, there's a notch in the case you're gonna line the mark up on, and you have two marks on that flywheel. So you have a fire mark and a mark with a T. You wanna ignore the fire mark and only worry about the line next to the T. Now that we have our timing marks lined up, we can take our valve clearance measurements, and the specs for our intake is 16/100ths of a millimeter, and the exhaust is 28/100ths of a millimeter, and both of those are plus or minus 3/100ths of a millimeter. So we're gonna get in there. I'm gonna start with a 15/100ths of a millimeter measurement. That goes in easy. So next I'm gonna take my 0.18. There's a little bit of drag on that. We'll take one more measurement. So this one actually measures at 0.18 millimeters. That's still within spec. This other one, I'm getting bigger feeler gauges in, so we'll go until we can't fit one in there. All right, so we've taken our measurements. This one right here, we're at 0.18 millimeters. This one is at 0.20 millimeters. This one's just a little over the limit, so we will adjust that. All right, moving on to the exhaust, we'll start with the 28/100ths of a millimeter. So on this, we actually measure 0.20 millimeters on this, and the other side we're at 0.25. So we'll write those measurements down. We're gonna compare our specs, and then we're gonna remove the camshaft and figure out which shims we need to put back in. And the other thing, if all your clearances were within spec, then you can proceed with reassembly. All right, so now that we know we need to make adjustments to our valve clearances, we're gonna go ahead and remove this cam chain tensioner. So we're gonna go ahead, we need to remove this bolt or loosen this center bolt on the back of our tensioner first. That's gonna help with reassembly. And then we're actually gonna remove both bolts out of the tensioner and remove the complete assembly. And when you do this, make sure that you remove the gasket. All right, on the older style camshafts that didn't have the auto decompressor as part of the cam sprocket, you can use a cam gear holding tool to help remove the sprocket. But for us, what we're gonna do is hold the crankshaft from moving on that right side, and then we're gonna loosen this bolt. After it's loosened, we'll rotate the engine over one full turn. That's gonna make it so we can access the other cam sprocket bolt. We'll remove that one all the way, rotate the engine over one more time, and then we can actually remove this bolt. And just keep in mind that second bolt that you take out, you really need to make sure that your timing mark on the flywheel is still lined up with top dead center. So at this point, I'm gonna take the safety wire and I'm gonna remove our cam sprocket, and I'm gonna hook the wire to the cam chain so it doesn't fall down into the bottom end. All right, now that we have our camshaft sprocket off, we're ready to remove the cam holder. So I'm gonna loosen this up in a couple steps in a crisscross pattern. And when you take these bolts out, 2 of them are actually going to be longer than the other 2. So these shorter ones are coming out of the back. When we pull this up, keep in mind on this auto decompression system where it was part of our cam sprocket, there's actually a loose piece that can come out right there, so it might be a good idea to keep a finger on that. And then also when you're lifting up, there's buckets underneath this main holder, and you really want to pay attention. Make sure you don't drop any shims into the side, and pay attention to these exhaust shims as well. So I'm just going to stuff a rag next to our cam chain, and that way we don't drop anything down into the bottom end. So there's our piece in the camshaft. And these are our buckets right here that I was talking about. And then both shims actually stayed in the buckets. So make sure you keep track of those and keep track of which valve they came off of, because we need to take measurements and get the correct shims back into the correct spots. I'm just going to use a magnet to get these exhaust shims out of the way. So these shims normally have numbers stamped onto them. So this one says 2.10, so 2.10 millimeters is what that is. And they come in either steps of 0.05 or 0.025 millimeter increments, depending which brand you get. And the measurements on all of our shims are actually all worn off. So we're going to use a digital caliper, measure these, and then we'll write down those measurements next to our valve clearance measurements that we took earlier. So the way we wrote this out is we have our exhaust valves and intake valves right here. These 2 valves are actually within spec, so we don't need to do anything to them. And these 2 we need to make adjustments, so we need to plug these numbers into a math formula, and that's going to give us our new shim thickness to give us the correct clearance. Now moving on to our right intake valve, we're going to plug our measurements into the formula. So we measured 0.20 millimeters, we minus our spec, so 0.16 millimeters, that comes down to 0.04 millimeters, and if we add our old shim thickness to that, we get 1.86 millimeters. So again, we're going to round down to a 1.85 millimeter shim. But if you had something, say this came out to 1.88 or 1.89 millimeters, then obviously you round up to a 1.9 shim. So this is what the shim kit looks like. And I've got our 220 right here. So I'm going to put that where that exhaust valve is and make sure I get this old exhaust shim out of the way. And then same thing with the intake, get the old shim out of the way so we don't accidentally put it in. Now since we have these parts out, we want to do a brief visual inspection and just check for any signs of obvious damage. So if there's any deep gouges or grooves in these buckets, you want to get them replaced. And if these are grooved out, then obviously this cam holder is going to be damaged where they ride as well. But again, these look pretty good. And you also want to check this cam, make sure the lobes aren't rounded off. A lot of times if you see discoloration in this camshaft, like severe bluing, then it probably means that you have other damage as well. So this one looks good, and we're going to go ahead, we'll install these shims back onto the valves, and we'll start the reassembly process. And just before I put these shims back into place, I'm actually going to go around our sealing surface for a valve cover gasket and make sure everything's cleaned off. And as we go back together, I'm putting assembly lube on all of the parts, including the shims, camshaft, and even the threads of those cam holder bolts. All right, now for the camshaft holder, I've already put assembly lube on the buckets and installed them onto the holder. We'll flip this over. I'm going to keep my fingers over these buckets until they're almost onto the valves. That way they don't fall out. And then also you want to check and make sure your dowel pins are in place. So we'll flip this over. Keep in mind we have this loose piece on the end of the camshaft. We have assembly lube on it, and we're going to orientate the camshaft so the lobes are facing the rear of the machine. At this point, I'm going to remove the shop towel we had, and I'm going to work the cam holder into place. Again, it shouldn't take too much force, but you might have to rock it just a little bit to get the dowel pins lined up. Next, we'll install our bolts into the cam holder. Again, the short ones go into the back side, long ones on the front. We'll tighten these in a crisscross pattern to 10 foot-pounds. At this point, you can make sure the cam lobes are facing away from any valves, and we can double check that we made the correct adjustments on both the intake and exhaust valves. And once you've verified you have the correct measurements now, then we can proceed with reassembly. Now for the other style of auto decompressor. Once you have all of the correct shims in their places, you need to make one more adjustment. There's an arm that's going to come onto your right side exhaust valve, and you're going to take whatever measurement your clearance is for that valve. So on ours it was 12 thousandths of an inch. You need to add 14 thousandths of an inch for the auto decompressor arm. So added together we get 26 thousandths of an inch. So we need to fit a 26 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge in between this tappet and the rocker arm. If it doesn't fit, you need to loosen the jam nut and adjust the set screw. And if you have too much clearance, again, you're going to want to adjust that. Once that clearance is in spec, we'll continue with reassembly. So our next step, what we're going to do is clean out the threads on the end of the camshaft where that sprocket bolts on. And the reason we're doing this is we're using Loctites on the bolts, and for the Loctite to set up right, the threads need to be clean and free of any oil. Next, I'm going to clean the sprocket off and the sprocket bolts. Now that we're cleaned up, we're ready to reinstall the cam sprocket, but I do want to point out that, again, we need to make sure the timing marks still lined up on the flywheel. Once you've verified that, the timing marks you'll use for this cam sprocket are this triangle right here on the cam holder, and 180 degrees across from that there's another arrow, and it's kind of hard to see, it's right behind this frame. What we'll do is take our cam sprocket, and there's actually two little lines right here. Those two lines will center up with the tip of the arrows that are on the cam holder. And while you're installing this, don't forget, this is part of your auto decompressor, and that tab coming out of the camshaft needs to be lined up in the center of this. All right, now I'm going to take the cam chain, fish it back up, and remove our safety wire. And I'm going to put the sprocket pretty close to where it actually needs to be. So our cam sprocket actually lined up perfectly with our timing marks. Our flywheel's still in the correct position, but if it didn't, you can just keep moving it on the cam chain until the marks line up perfectly. Then we'll install the two bolts. We'll torque them to 14 foot-pounds. And again, we're going to start by installing one bolt, rotate the crankshaft one revolution, install the second bolt, torque it down. Go one more revolution, then torque that second bolt. And both of these bolts, when we reinstall them, we'll be using blue thread lock on the threads. Next, we'll clean up our sealing surface for our gasket on the cam chain tensioner using contact cleaner and a rag. And then I went ahead and sprayed all these parts off with some contact cleaner that go to the tensioner. Made sure the gasket surfaces are clean. We have our two new gaskets right here. And what we'll do now is remove the bolt from the back of the tensioner assembly. And we're going to check and make sure this tensioner is doing its job. To do that, we're going to take a small flat blade screwdriver. We'll stick it in the slot in the back, and then we'll turn it clockwise and make sure the tensioner comes in all the way. I'm going to remove the screwdriver, and the tensioner should spring out all the way just like that. If it only comes out part way or not at all, you know you have a problem and need to replace the tensioner. But ours is fine, so what we're gonna do is install it. We'll use our new gaskets, and keep in mind when you install it like this, what you're gonna have to do is keep the tensioner all the way wound up with the screwdriver, and it's very important to make sure that it's wound all the way in during installation. If it's not, then you can actually damage your cam chain, because if this is out and then you try to push it in further, it's going to press too hard on the cam chain. So now I'm going to take my first gasket, followed by the spacer, second gasket, and then at this point I'm actually going to stick the bolts through it. We'll set all of this in place, and I'm actually going to start these bolts a couple of threads without forcing them into place. As long as you're doing this by hand, you should be okay. Get these bolts started, and that way everything's lined up and there's less pieces to hold. So now that we're lined up, before we put those bolts in any further, what we need to do is, again, stick the screwdriver in, wind up the tensioner, take all the tension away, and then we can tighten down our bolts. You can see when we have that wound up, I can actually press the tensioner into place by hand. That's going to make it easier to get these bolts tightened up. All right, now I can release the tension. And after that, we'll install the bolt on the back of the tensioner and make sure that we have that sealing washer in place. Now that we have the valve train components reassembled, what we're going to do is check our work, and how we're going to do that is rotate the engine over 2 full revolutions. We'll double check our timing marks and also the valve clearances, make sure everything's correct, and then we can go over to the bench. We're going to install a new valve cover gasket. All right, so back over at the bench, we're going to install a new gasket onto our valve cover. All right, we're going to clean this groove out, and we'll use a little bit of gasket cinch on it and then install our new valve cover gasket. Once we have the gasket set into place, I'm going to remove any excess gasket cinch. While it's setting up, I'll put the new O-rings on our timing plugs and install those. Next step is to install the valve cover. After that, we'll install a new spark plug, and again, this is just a good idea. Since you're in here, these don't get changed out that often, so we recommend doing this just to prevent any problems. Reinstall the spark plug cap. Then we'll take our breather tube, install it back onto the cover, make sure that the clamp is in place, and after that we can reinstall the plastic tray. Don't forget to attach the ground wire on your ignition coil or the engine coolant temp sensor. With the plastic tray in place, we can reinstall the gas tank, front fenders, and seat. And that's it for checking and adjusting the valve clearance on these TRX450Rs. If you need either the shim kit or valve cover gaskets, things like that, or anything else for your machine, check it out on our website. We have a lot of different options, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.